Welcome to Wednesday Walks Together. My name is Mark Long, rector of the parish of St Andrew in Newlands, Cape Town. I'd like to reflect on the word normal. What images, definitions, concepts come to mind when you hear that word? When I reflect on normal, I think back to what life was like before the pandemic, to what life was like before lockdown. If you were to ask me, is life normal at the moment? I would say no, it's not. It's abnormal. It's out of whack. What are my expectations for the future? Well, my expectations or my hopes is that life will return to normal. But of course, the question needs to come, will it? One of the definitions that I came across this week in a webinar I was watching is that normal is what we expect. So when things happen and they're not what we expect, we say, this is not normal. Now, we live in a world that actually is full of constant change on all sorts of levels. But up until the pandemic, our experience of normal or change was the change was not hugely dramatic, not overly dramatic. It had sped up. New phones and all sorts of other bits of technology were increasingly a little bit more difficult to cope with, but we'd kind of worked that into what we understood to be normal. The pandemic and lockdown and all the changes that has brought has really put change in the spotlight in a whole new way. And I think most of us have kind of come to terms with the fact that life after lockdown will not be normal in terms of what life was like before lockdown. And I find myself using the phrase, the new normal. But what on earth do I mean by that? Reality is that there will never be a new normal because change will always be constant. But what we are facing is a new context. And within the new context, there will be new norms, new expectations of what life is and should be. But what lockdown is also showing us is that, in fact, change is happening all the time. Just as we begin to think that this is now normal, the alert level changes, something happens, deaths go up, cases go up, and suddenly what has been normal for a day or two is not normal anymore. Our expectations are constantly having to evolve. Now, my question to this is, where does our faith fit in to all of this? Today we remember John the Baptist. John came in and John wasn't normal. He came out of the desert, he was eating locusts, he was clearly a little wild, certainly in appearance, and the things he had to say certainly were not the usual. And he began a time in the life of Israel, a time of preparing people for what God was going to be doing through Jesus Christ. John begins to shift the expectations of normal. And of course, Jesus comes in and shifts those even more dramatically. And after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, the Spirit is given, and things are turned in many ways on their heads. God is working in our world in ways that have never been experienced before. And we find, as we explore through the book of Acts and the Gospels, we see the early Christian communities really trying to work out what this all means. And so the context is changing. And within that, God is working. And the nature of life is that there is this constant change. And we can trust that in the midst of it, God actually is always present. And so while we cope with the changes and as we feel anxious and fearful perhaps of what life may look like in the future, actually God is there walking with us, being part of our lives. When Jesus faces Pontius Pilate, for example, actually Pontius Pilate's response in setting Barabbas free, in having Jesus flogged and crucified, that was normal. A normal expectation of how those in authority would respond. The people cry out for something, Pilate gives in to that, and we see the injustice that is carried with those decisions. So one of the interesting things about John the Baptist is that John actually steps up and challenges the kind of decisions that people like Pilate make. John's adversary in that context was Herod, and challenges Herod in terms of the way he's living. Herod, intrigued a bit by John, because he clearly wasn't used to having people call him to account, and it wasn't normal to have someone do that. Herod's new wife, of course, is a little bit more upset by John the Baptist, and of course manipulates the situation eventually to have him beheaded. But it's people like John the Baptist, people like Jesus, and many of the saints of part of the history of our faith, who have the courage to embrace the change that they perceive happening, and to see something of the activity of God in that, and to amplify what it is that God is doing in their own context and time. And as they do that, so new normals develop, new expectations develop, new ways of seeing life develop. Those ways are not always new, but a renewal perhaps of understanding what the purpose of life and our lives are all about, and embracing those changes. So I'm not sure how you're coping with normal at this point, or how you're coping with abnormal at this point, or even how you're coping with what you expect for the future. But I would encourage us to trust in that presence of God, that presence that was with John the Baptist, that presence that lived itself out so powerfully in and through the life and ministry of Jesus. That presence that has stood by some of the great saints of our Christian faith. And that presence that stands with you and me. To trust that if God is our center, the vortex of life around us can be faced. And no matter what the challenges of the moment or the fears for the future may be, that actually as we hold to that center which is God in our lives, the Holy Spirit walking and holding us, is critical to the journey ahead. And so let us not fear the change in context, and let us allow normal to be what it is right now, and to know that it will be a little different later in the day, later in the week, and certainly later in the year.